They came back with banners and wine, the longships cutting clean lines through low autumn fog. Yet beneath the decking, beneath the cheers and the drums, something else rode home with them. Women, bound, silent. A shadowed freight that would not be celebrated in the saga's proud rhymes, but would be counted, traded, and remade into property. She is known in the fragments that survive by no single certain name. Scholars have transcribed variants, Holfer, horrifying, Ulf. For the purposes of what we can responsibly reconstruct, I will refer to her as Holfer indefinido. She was taken during the sack of Jorvik after her husband, named in some sources as Yidrick indefinido, fell trying to defend their home. The longship's arrival marked the end of one life and the brutal start of another. Cold iron on wrists, bread given in portions, the smell of smoke and tar, and nights spent in the hold where oars kept time like a heartbeat. As she later dictated to a monk, whose Latin summary survives in a monastery ledger, she described the first cold nights, the plank under her back, the muffled trampling of boots above, the taste of soot. These are not exact quotations from an eyewitness sitting in our living room. They are paraphrased recollections, translated and recorded by another hand. Even so, they give us a human frame for policies and rituals we otherwise encounter as abstract words in sagas and legal fragments. To understand what happened to Holfer, we must first understand what the conquerors practiced and what those practices meant to Norse society. Conquest was not simply a redistribution of land and goods. It was a remaking of people's legal identities. One name for the ritual that formalized this transformation appears in several saga passages and monastery notes. Trelatal. The word signals a tally and a transfer, an official moment in which captives were counted, names were stripped or reassigned, and social status was recast. Women who passed through that process could be labeled frila, a legally diminished class. Frila were no longer wives in the eyes of the law. They had lost claims of kinship and protection. They had become property, commodities in a market that stretched from the North Sea to the rivers of Eastern Europe. The sagas, the testimony of travelers, and archaeology worked together to sketch this world. Saga fragments describe processions of captives presented before leaders, their hair shorn and their belongings taken. Travelers' accounts, most famously Ibn Fadlan's description of a Rus funeral, record public rituals where a woman associated with the dead man was laid out and, by the eyewitness's eye, executed as part of the rite. Archaeology corroborates uncomfortable details. In graves and settlement sites from Burka and Hedeby, Edeb, to Firkat and Trelabog, skeletal analysis has revealed trauma patterns consistent with both violent death and repeated physical stress. In some burial assemblages, the arrangement of goods and bodies suggests the inclusion of people who may have been captives rather than kin. Market records and trading routes attest to bustling slave markets at river crossroads and coastal towns. Prices differed by age, skill, and perceived usefulness. Taken together, these lines of evidence make clear that what war returned home with the raiders was integral to a system, economic, legal, and cultural, that normalized the taking and exchange of human beings. For a woman like Holfer, being declared a frila changed everything. She was assigned to an owner, Bjorn Ironide, according to the fragmentary household lists that survive. But remember that names in these sources are often inconsistent. Treat such identifiers as indefinido where necessary. Assigned to Bjorn, Holfer was moved into a subsidiary hut, not the longhouse where Bjorn's free family ate and slept. Her quarters were colder, closer to the livestock, and her food measured. Her days were regimented labor, fetching water, tending fires, weaving, mending tools and clothing, carrying peat. She labored in the household economy, sustaining those who could buy status and projecting subsistence for those who had none. Sexual coercion was an expected and enforced dimension of her servitude. Language here must be precise, sober, and spare. Holfer was subjected to repeated sexual violence. She was forced to serve sexually by those who considered her property. No graphic detail is needed to comprehend the humiliation and bodily violation involved. The historical record does not lend itself to lurid reenactment. It does, however, allow us to understand consequences. Pregnancies born of coercion, children often inheriting the social status of the mother, and the layering of shame and stigma that outlived the physical acts. The captors did more than physically control bodies. They engineered social isolation between captives and used ritual and economic pressure to fracture solidarity. Among the freeless, hierarchical divisions were cultivated. Senior captives, those with useful skills like spinning or nursing, might be allowed marginally better sleeping places or slightly more food. New arrivals would be paraded, chosen, or purchased in what has been described in sagas as knights of choice, a euphemism for public decision-making over the fate of newly captured women. These rituals were not emotionally neutral. They created forced competition. Captives, desperate to survive and sometimes to protect children they bore, could be compelled into acts that later became lifelong wounds. It is in this moral geometry that Holfer's deepest injury occurs. There is a passage in the monastic transcript, again paraphrased from her later dictation, that captures this moral rupture. She tells of a winter evening when the household gathered as a new group of women were brought in, shackled and crying. Bjorn's household lined up. The privileged among the household reached out, tasting the spectacle as if it were a market fair. Holfer remembers being ordered to take parts for the household's selection. "They made me point," she later told the monk, "as if I had a choice. My hand shook. I chose the one who would be sent to the Lord's bed that night. My fingers remembered. My heart refused." The monk records this confession as a wound that did not heal. She calls it a guilt born under duress, a wound that cannot be undone. Historians reading such accounts must be careful. A single confession, recorded by a cleric, runs through filters: the captive's voice, the translator's choices, the cleric's need to frame a narrative that corresponds to moral teaching. Yet the moral integrity of the account is supported by multiple corroborations. Saga reports of households exerting public choice over captives, legal texts referencing assignment of captives to household heads, and archaeological evidence of differentiated living spaces for unfree people. What is singular in Holfer's narrative is the intimacy of memory, the small sensory details that make structural violence human: the rasp of rope across palm skin, the bitter taste of scavenged grain, the pressure behind the eye that never relaxed. If the story were to end with that first winter, it would be the ending imposed on many women: a life of unfreedom, children born into servitude, names lost from genealogies. But the title of this piece asks us to consider a night that changed her fate. We must be scrupulous here. The sources do not supply a documented miracle night in Holfer's life. What they do give us are plausible mechanisms by which a woman's status might shift: storm, sail, escape, or subtle social reclassification. Any dramatization must be labeled as such, a plausible reconstruction rather than a newly discovered fact. With that caveat, consider one historically grounded scenario: plausible, constrained by the evidence and consistent with the surviving testimonies. A transfer of custody via market exchange or purchase by a religious house, or a mercantile outsider who treated captives differently. Slave markets were precisely the places where property changed hands. Monasteries, traders, and individual patrons sometimes bought captives for service, labor, or, in rare cases, to place them within their own institutions. We know such purchases occurred because contemporaneous records and later monastic inventories note the acquisition and reclassification of people once thought to be beyond the pale. It is plausible, then, that on a winter night at a trading quay, Holfer, already assigned to Bjorn, was moved again. Imagine the quay, mud and ice underfoot, torches guttering in a raw wind, the shout of buyers and sellers ricocheting off timbered warehouses. The market clerk reads prices, a trader with a cloak splattered from travel steps forward. A monk appears, rare but never impossible, and offers coin. This transfer need not be heroic or pure. It is not a cinematic rescue. It is an economic transaction, but it carries consequences. Purchased by someone with different priorities, perhaps a monk who assigns her to work for the community in a way that affords marginal safety, or a trader who employs her in a household more stable than Bjorn's, her immediate physical dangers may lessen. The shadow under her ribs may not leave, but the frequency and nature of abuse can change. It is essential to acknowledge the costs, Being transferred from Bjorn to another owner did not magically restore Holfer to full personhood or reunite her with kin. She may have been secularly safer but still subject to servitude. Children she bore, if any, might remain stigmatized, and social reintegration remained rare. The stigma of being Freela could follow her into any house, and local communities often saw captives as forever outside kinship. In this reconstructed night, therefore, what changes is not miraculous freedom, but a different kind of constrained life, one in which Holfer has room to survive in ways previously denied, and crucially, the physical stability to later recount what she had endured. The later pages of the monastic ledger describe that she spent years at a religious house on the coastal margin of a trading town. There, a monk recorded her story not in her own voice, but as a translated recollection. The monk's Latin line, terse and weary, closes the account. Multa passus est, literally, she suffered much. That line is both confirmation and condemnation. It is an outsider's summation that recognizes suffering without romanticizing survival. The monk's record becomes itself a form of testimony, imperfect and partial, but valuable for what it preserves. A human life that would otherwise be absented by scandal, shame, or silence. Archaeological and forensic work offers grim corroboration for the systemic mechanisms sketched in Holfer's narrative. At sites like Birka and Hedeby, analysts have found burial contexts and skeletal markers indicative of repetitive labor loads and interpersonal violence. At some coastal burial grounds, differential grave goods and body arrangement suggest that not all those buried alongside warriors were kin. Some appear to be individuals whose lives were appropriated in death and life by the victor class. Ibn Fadlan's description of a Rus funeral, where one woman, tied and placed upon the pyre with the dead lord, is said to have been ritually slain, adds a traveler's horror to what archaeology and saga fragments suggest. Forensic examinations of such remains often show trauma patterns consistent with constricted living and ritualized violence. No single line of evidence gives us the full picture. Together, they form overlapping meshes that highlight a system of gendered exploitation embedded in the practices of warfare and commerce. The personal consequences of this system are long and generational. Children fathered in conditions of coercion were frequently treated as the mother's property or relegated to low-status labor roles. Their legal status often followed the mother's. Survivors like Holfer, who lived long enough to be recorded by clerics, were exceptions. The majority remained anonymous in both the literary and the archaeological record. What we do find in the sources, however, is the repetition of certain motifs: the stripping of names, the relegation to service, the ritualization of transfer, and once in a while, the purchase or transfer that altered daily risk. These are not isolated anecdotes, but structural features of a world where war and trade intersected with gendered vulnerability. We should also address the machinery of dehumanization. The trilateral rituals, the nights of choice, the parading of captives, all work to recast human beings as objects of exchange and spectacle. Even the linguistic erasure of a name serves to make a person fungible. The social technologies of the household enforced this transformation. Rules by which a household head decided whose labor was useful, rituals that publicly affirmed a man's honor through possession, and marketplaces that translated that honor into coin. Captives were thus doubly victimized, by the violence that took them and by the cultural practices that made their continued suffering legible as normal or necessary. Yet, even within these constraints, small acts of resistance and human solidarity appear. Archaeology hints at clandestine networks, objects hidden in domiciles, modifications to clothing that suggest attempts to maintain pre-capture identity. Saga literature records instances of captives maintaining quiet defiance through language, through preserving names in whispered circles, or through secret alliances within the household that helped someone survive an otherwise impossible winter. Holfer's own confession to the monk, about being forced to choose a newcomer, contains a trace of moral resistance. She insists that she had no true agency in that choice, that it was imposed on her body and spirit. That insistence matters. It offers a counterweight to narratives that would simplify victims into willing participants or powerless automatons. And yet the aftermath remained hard. Even if Holfer found relative safety, social exile persisted. In communities where kinship determined access to bread, justice, and reputation, a former Frila, even when living under amicable conditions, remained an outsider. Her voice had been filtered first by submission, then by transmission through Latin and monastic bureaucracy. The monk who recorded her story had his own priorities: spiritual teaching, confession as moral example, the preservation of a soul, and those priorities shaped what he chose to record and the cadence he gave it. When he closed with, "She suffered much," he gave the record a sober, moral frame. Not a redemption narrative, not a vindication, but a sober witness. We must close with what these stories demand of us now. Historians and storytellers share a responsibility to hold the line between plausible reconstruction and invention, between empathetic imagination and false certainty. When we dramatize a night that changed a prisoner's fate, we must label it as reconstruction, an interpretive bridge across gaps in the record, not as discovery. The choice of the monastery purchase above is one such bridge, historically possible, supported by market records and monastic inventories, and coherent with the presence of a monk's later record. But it is not an ironclad truth. We owe victims more than a tidy narrative. We owe them careful testimony and a refusal to let their lives be reduced to mere plot devices in tales of adventure. Holfer's life, as preserved in fragments, teaches a broader lesson about the scale of human suffering behind celebrated conquest. Across centuries and along trade routes, tens of thousands of women were displaced, bought, sold, and sometimes killed as part of rituals that legitimized power and consolidated wealth. Their names are largely unrecorded. Their graves, if they exist at all, are anonymous. Archaeology can reveal patterns. Comparative literature and surviving monastic entries can put voice to what might otherwise remain silent. But memory requires more than artifacts. It requires narrative care. We must speak their stories without turning them into spectacle, without reducing them to mere subplots in the histories of warrior elites. As the monk's Latin line insists, "She suffered much." That closing is not a neat moral. It is an indictment. It asks us to look at a past that has often been romanticized and to reframe it in human terms. These women were not extras in a tale of exploration and glory. They were people whose identities were stripped, whose labor and bodies underpinned new fortunes, whose offspring sometimes carried the mark of their mother's capture for generations. If you care about uncovering the untold sides of history, subscribe now for more deep dives into the human stories behind the ruins and the records. The past is never only about great men and great battles. It is the accumulation of countless private tragedies and small survivals. We reconstruct them, not to satisfy curiosity, but to restore dignity. Remember this when you next see a longship in a museum diorama or a saga's single line about a prize. The glittering shields and the rhythmic oars are built upon human lives that were remade by force. The obligation of historians, and of all who tell these stories, is to name those lives where we can, to note where our reconstructions begin and end, and to refuse the romance that would convert atrocity into legend. Holfer, Indefinito's night that changed her fate, reconstructed here as a purchase or transfer, gives us a nuanced alternative to heroic rescue or uninterrupted suffering. It offers an historically grounded middle, survival in a different arrangement, a chance to live long enough to speak, and yet an absence of simple restoration. Her later dictation to the monk, preserved as a fragment framing her life in terms of endurance, is a final gift. It requires us centuries later to listen and to make room for those voices, to name the victims when possible, to mark the gaps where names are lost, and to carry forward the simple, solemn task of remembering. Find detailed sources and further reading in the description below. Share this story so that those who were reduced to the margins of history do not remain margin notes. The past keeps echoing in the present. Remembering is a first step toward repair.